Good morning, everybody. So we will start the class as the college webinar has been attached to the classroom. So the people who are about to join, you can join through either classroom or web. Now, after yesterday class, let us discuss about the fourth unit. Okay. So till the last class we have discussed about only up to third unit. Now today we will discuss about fourth unit. Okay. Now let us go to the contents of the fourth unit. Guys, are you able to see my screen? Can anyone please respond? Guys, are you able to see my screen? Could you please reply anybody?
Yes, sir.
So today we will discuss about the fourth unit which we are having in our syllabus. That is disaster management in India, disaster profile of India, and the mega disaster that has taken place in India, and Disaster Management Act 2005. So institutional and financial mechanisms, national policies on disaster management, role of government and non-government organization agencies. So these are the major contents of the syllabus. Now let us discuss about the major disaster that has taken place in India. In the worst case, starting from the last four worst disasters which we can consider, this 1984 Bhopal gas tragedy. So due to this gas tragedy, almost up to 3,500 have been killed and several people have been injured in that disaster. So while coming to the another notable disaster, earthquake, Gujarat earthquake in 2001. In this earthquake, almost 10,000 around have been killed sorry, 20,000 around people have been killed, and up to 340 buildings have been demolished, destroyed. So it is not only about taking lives of the people, and also infrastructural damage. That means financially and socially, a major damage has been taken place. And in 2004 again, Indian Ocean tsunami, which has been almost majority of the countries have been hit by this ocean tsunami. But in India, especially when we are dealing with the effect of the tsunami, almost approximately we are having 15,000, 10,000 to 15,000 people are being killed. That means 10,000 have been killed and 5,000 are missing. So approximately we can say 10 to 15,000 lives have been taken. And not only that, several structures that have been damaged due to this. And while coming to the 2008 Mumbai attacks, so in 2008, almost 9 suicide bombers have been attacked Mumbai. In that, on a whole, almost 175 people have been killed and several have been injured. So such type of disasters where we can considerably make a note that the precautionary measurements, how we are going to take, how we are going to implement, how we need to be aware. The human-made disasters that will be very vulnerable when we compare with the natural disasters. So the terrorist attacks, not only India, the majority of the countries of the globe are facing the same problem. So that is a human-made disaster. So it is highly impossible to predict or to control such type of disasters. But when we are dealing with other types of disasters, there is a possibility of a control. As we have been discussing, how to minimize the damage, how to minimize the effect of the disasters in the last unit. So as the vulnerability criteria of disasters come to India, especially, as we are speaking, 57% of the land of India is exposed to or sensitive to earthquake, or we can say earthquake prone areas, earthquake prone zones. As of entire India has been divided into 5 earthquake zones, from scaling from 0 to 5. The intensity is from, zoning 1 to 5. Intensity starts from 0 to 5, and the major earthquake zones will be considered in the 5th zone. That means high intensity, Richter scale around above 7. Above 7 will be treated as a high intensity earthquakes. And also when you are dealing with severe earthquakes, that will be that can be categorized as a 12% of the land of India is vulnerable to the severe earthquakes. And while coming to the another type of disaster where we have already discussed about the drought, its causes and its effects, and taking of what we can say precautionary measurements. So it is about 68% of the land is going to be considered as a drought prone areas in India. This is only about our Indian geological conditions. And while coming to the flood zones, majority, very comparatively, only 12% will be vulnerable to the flood zone. That means whatever the land of the total overall land of India, when you consider, only 12% is being exposed to the flood zones. And while coming to the another type of a disaster called cyclones. So cyclones are very minimal in India comparatively with other countries, especially when you compare with the United States. So there the probability, vulnerability of occurrence of cyclones are at a higher rate. But when we compare with the Indian geological conditions, only 8% of the land is vulnerable to the cyclones. So apart from natural disasters, some cities in India are also vulnerable to chemical and industrial disasters, which we are going to treat them as a man-made disasters. Not only that, these terrorist attacks will also be considered as a man-made disasters. So we can look at this earthquake zoning map of India. This, okay. So probably in the according to the IS Bureau of Indian Standards, IS code 1893, it is given here in 2002. This is according to the 2002 classification. We have only 4 zones: zone 1, zone 5, zone 4, zone 3, zone 2. But according to the Bureau of Indian Standards Code of Practice IS 1893 2010, we are having 10 zones, sorry, 5 zones, which is zone starting from 1. So what is the difference between this 2002 IS code and 2010 IS code? Only the difference is in 2002 till 2002, according to the code of practice, there are zones which is considered under no earthquake zone. But after 2010, every zone is being considered under seismic zones. That means earthquake prone zones. So in this you can look at the diagram map of India. Wherever you see the red dots, that is the high intensive earthquake occurring zones. These are the high intensity. At a Richter scale above 7.5 will be treated as a red zones. And after that, zone 4, you can look at the zone 4. So in zone 4, most probably it is along Himalayas, Jammu, Kashmir and Delhi. Okay, and while coming to the zone 3, in zone 3 you can look at the yellow. So Ahmedabad and major part of this Maharashtra and some of the portion of Kerala and some of the portion of Tamil Nadu. So and coastal belts at Madras, Chennai and Calcutta. These are okay. So these are the Lucknow and Ahmedabad. These are also be included in the zone 4, zone 3. While coming to the zone 2, you can look at the majority of the portion is being categorized as zone 2. But now this zone 2 become zone 3 according to the classification. So zone 1 will be having a very low intensity, which is considered as a Richter scale lesser than 3. While coming to the flood zones, as we compare with the flood zones, only we are having 12%, right? 12% of the land is being considered as a flood zone. So you can look at wherever the blue color is being given. So those areas are being considered as a flood zones, especially majority of the Punjab, Haryana, Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and here in Mumbai, Meghalaya, and West Bengal, Orissa, and some portion of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and some portion of Kerala. So these all are being considered as a flood zones. And while coming to the wind and cyclone zones, according to the IS code of practice, we can look at the map of India where the very high intensity zones are being categorized as a zone A. Zone A to zone B, and zone A depending upon the wind speed. Wind speed, if it is greater than 55 miles per second, that is another category. And if it is below 50, that below 50 to 55, that means the wind speed. Depending upon the wind speed, they have categorized as the 6 zones. 6 zones of wind and cyclone zones. So you can look at the picture, and very low damage risk zone will be considered as a below 33 miles per second. So that is the wind speed, depending upon the wind speed. And while coming to the management, disaster management. So when we are dealing with the disaster management, as of we know, as we discussed this in the previous class also, even though we are having a disaster management in India. So before going to that, we need to be very clear with this, the operations that were the stages where we are going to consider the cycle of the disaster management. So in this, if we look at the diagram, the cycle, so before disaster and after disaster, post disaster. So, and there is also a portion called during a disaster. The mitigation and preparedness will be considered as a before disaster, occurrence of the disaster. After the occurrence of the disaster, recovery and mitigation will also be considered. And during the disaster, the response will be accounted. So these are the 4 stages where we are going to explain about the disaster. Let us come to the preparedness. So according to the Disaster Management Act, if we would like to explain about preparedness, that means the activities prior to a disaster will be treated as a preparedness. That means in this preparedness, plans or preparation of plans will be there, and emergency exercises and trainings will be included, and warning systems will be included. And while coming to the response, whatever the response that is going to take place during the disaster, it depends upon the disaster, right? If it is flood, for suppose say, during the flood, the rescue operations will be operated, right? So that is the response. And if it is earthquake, it is highly impossible to respond during the disaster. Why? Because earthquakes cannot stand for a long durations, right? So in that scenario, the response during the disaster is highly impossible. If it is cyclone, of course we will be having. If it is drought, of course we are having. But when we are dealing with this response includes of warning systems and warning propagation and emergency operations, such operations and rescue operations, as we are speaking. That is called response. This could be during the disaster or after immediate disaster. While coming to the recovery, so whenever we are going to think about the recovery, when we have been strained by means of any of the natural forces or man-made forces, so again the recovery means we are going to have the same flexibility as we are having before the disaster. That is where we are going to deal with recovery. So in this recovery, the activities which we are going to consider are after the disaster. That's all, following the disaster. And to take the best example for that, preparation or accommodating the affected people. That means by means of preparing them temporary housing and providing them a proper food and medication and counselings. So this consists of a recovery. And now, while coming to the mitigation, so mitigation always it is about reducing the effects of disaster, which is going to be implemented by means of assessment and preparation of that means the steps that we take to prepare plans. That is where we are going to call it as a mitigation. So activities that reduce the effects of disaster is going to be treated as a mitigation. The best examples we are going to consider they are as building codes and zonings, vulnerability analysis, public education. That means awareness. So what is the role of this building codes and zonings? As we have seen these zonings, right? Yeah, this is earthquake and flood, cyclones like that. Droughts will also, if we categorize, that means it depends upon the analysis. So when we are going to zone areas, initially you need to have the data, previous data. That means historical data about 100 years or 50 years or 20 years, whatever the data available. That means statistics. Whenever the probability of these so-called disasters are being assessed, then to assess that, to analyze that, to predict that, we need the previous data of any of the type of disaster. For suppose say let us consider earthquake. So history of earthquake we are going to consider over a period of 100 years or at least 50 years. So then depending upon the intense scales of the earthquake, intensities, damage, like that we are going to analyze and we are going to categorize such zones in as a intensity deferred zones, like we have discussed in this what we were, yeah, here you can look at this zone 5 4 3 2, like that we are able to analyze. So similarly, when we are going to adopt the codes, building codes, Bureau of Indian Standards will issue codal provisions for each and every manufacturing or practicing of engineering works or providing the supply of any sort of goods, any sort of manufacturing of any objects. These all will follow codes, including, for example, say the mobiles which we use, the computer which we use. These all will have codal provisions. So according to the codal norms, they have to prepare. Otherwise, that cannot be sanctioned by means of a Bureau of Indian Standards. So if it is not meeting the Bureau of Indian Standards criteria, then obviously the product cannot be practiced or cannot be launched or designed. It is not only about the product, it is will also, you can think it is also for design also. Any sort of designing means, could you design a stress system? Could you design a mechanism? Could you design a buildings, bridges, whatever you design, those should follow a certain course according to the Bureau of Indian Standards. That is where we call them as a building codes. Right? Now, let us go for Government of Indian organizations and non-government organizations. So there are several organizations which we can name them as NGOs. NGOs means non-government organizations. So these will also take part of our social responsibility and they will provide service for the society. The best example you can take Ramakrishna Mission. So this is a voluntary organization, non-government organization, and the funds, when you are discussing about the funds, so these so-called funds are completely from their own. That means from the public or from the society source, whatever you call. So any of the amount, whether it may be used for programming, that means training purpose, or establishing warning systems, or providing any of the supplies during the after the disaster recovery, in the portion of recovery, food supplies, medical supplies, any kind of activities, that are going to take place by means of any organization, they will have their own funding. Okay, so in government organizations, as of we are aware that the fund will be given by the government, right? For any sort of activities that will be carried before the disaster or during the disaster or after the disasters. So the funding will be from government sanctions. So in every year government will allot some amounts of funds to the central government and as well as the state governments to deal with the disasters such a any kind of disaster. It could be pandemic or epidemics, or it could be earthquake, it could be tsunami, it could be flood, it could be cyclone, any kind of disasters. So to deal with these disasters, that means state government disaster management will be there, central government disaster management will be there. Okay, so when you are dealing with disaster GOI and NGOs, disaster preparation and response committees, there will be several members we can consider. For suppose a World Vision of India and SOS Children Village India, this is also one of the voluntary organization, and Ramakrishna Mission as we speak, and Plan International, Oxfam India Trust, Lutheran World Service India, Red Cross, Catholic Relief Services, CASA. Like that, if you name, there will be n number of organizations. But especially when we are dealing with government organizations, disaster management authority will be there, DMA. So this will handle the disasters, and not only that, depending upon different types of disasters, different branches of organizations are going to take part in this disaster relief or recovery or response. So disaster management centers in India. So where these so-called government organizations have been located in India. So in Andhra Pradesh, Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, in each and every state, you can we are having disaster management centers, including in Hyderabad. Okay, so each and every state, in each and every state capital, we are able to find these disaster management centers. Okay, now while coming to the training program, okay, so when we are dealing with the training program, the only few specific disaster training programs will be having in, as a venue for a different types of disasters. For suppose a drought mitigation and management, industrial and chemical disasters, and what we can say ecosystem based disaster risk reduction, coastal community, depending upon different national level training programs will be organized every year. Okay, so whatever the programs that are being organized, they will be addressing each and every type of disaster management and precautionary measurements that are supposed to be taken, and the developments to improve the communication or warning systems of the corresponding disasters. So in each and every training program, these are the main focusing concern topics where they are going to improve the technology or apply the technology in the training programs. Okay, so when we are dealing with areas of concern, when we always to remember the area of concern, whenever any disaster that is going to take place, the area of concerns will differ from disaster to disaster. So on a common platform, when you are dealing with a few criteria, which let us see, activating an early warning systems network and its close monitoring. So if we are able to establish such kind of activity, then obviously the warning systems, due to the warning systems, we are able to communicate, and it is possible to minimize the either damage or loss of lives. And another important topic is mechanisms for integrating the scientific, technological, and administrative agencies for effective disaster management. So when you are going to combine this science, technology, and administrative agencies together, then when they are going to act in the disaster management very effectively, when we compare to deal with any other individual organization to act individually. So always the scientific, integrated science and technological and administrative agencies should act effectively together. So terrestrial communication links which collapse in the event of a rapid onset disaster, that is also one of the major criteria. And when you are dealing with the vulnerability of critical infrastructure like power supply, communication, water supply, transportation, etc. During the disaster, it is possibly we can observe, or suppose if it is a flood or earthquake or a tsunami or cyclone, whatever the disaster, if we are going to place, majority of the vulnerability will be considered by means of power supply breakout and communication breakout, water supply will be damaged, and transportation will also be possibly threat. These all etc. These all will be considered as under a threat. So during any of the disasters, possibly these so-called power supply or communication system should be taken care, and they should be in time properly, they should be operated. While coming to the funding, another major criteria is funding. As we are discussing, for each and every program, training, whether it may be a training program or it may be a development program or it may be a rescue program, any kind of program, it is very much fundamental that every program requires a funding. Okay, so this so-called relief fund will place a major role in the disaster response. And not only that, when you compare with the preparedness and mitigation, generally the people will ignore these two. That is the main reason the majority of the lives of loss of lives are taking place due to ignorance of preparedness and mitigation. As we discussed now, that what is preparedness? The plans that we are going to apply during the disaster or after the disaster, and training programs, rescue programs, this all will include in this preparedness and mitigation. And the mitigation will also be the steps that we are going to implement to prepare a plan. So disaster rescue plans. So when you are going to neglect this preparedness and mitigation, obviously the damage rate will be at a higher. So that is the another important criteria. Ignoring of these two will lead to very deficient management in the organization. And another most important consideration what we have to take is lack of integrated efforts to collect and compile data, information, and local knowledge on disaster history and traditional response patterns. All right, that means this so-called particular concern point indicates that if we are able to provide a proper knowledge regarding the disasters, that means when one kind of disaster occurs, how we are going to survive, what are the precautionary measurements we need to consider. For suppose say if it is a flood, then what we have to do? We, the so-called the local people should be able to understand the geological conditions where the highest points and lowest points of the surface. That means where the slopes are there, where the possibility of a flooding path will be there, and how to overcome that flood, and how to sustain, how to survive from that flood, whether to by claiming the trees or by going upwards of the highest points near to that particular area. This is called a local knowledge. Understood? So if we are able to provide such integrated knowledge to the concerned communities in particular areas, that will help people during the disaster to save or to survive themselves. That is the one of the most considerable criteria. And another criteria when we are looking at the standardization. So standard and need for standardized efforts in compiling and interpreting geospatial data, satellite imagery, and early warning signals. As we are currently the weather reports, how we are going to get weather reports? This is due to geospatial data, satellite images, and with the help of these, we are going to predict how much early the monsoon is coming, and how the cyclones are going to take place, like that. So how many days the rain is going to take place, how much intensity of the rain is going to take place. So this all will be due to the development in the spatial geospatial data. So when you have certain data, obviously depending upon that, the prediction and forecasting of that particular data in local areas will be available. So by utilizing the so-called interpretation of the geospatial data, satellite images, these two will help you to give the early warning systems, early signals of the upcoming threat. And another concern is weak areas continue to be forecasting, modeling, risk reduction, simulation, and scenario analysis, etc., etc. So when we find high intensive areas, which these areas are called weak areas, and not only that, the people who are not aware of the local circumstances, so they are supposed to be forecasted the data continuously and monitoring them very closely to avoid risk and to minimize the loss. So this requires a lot of modeling and analysis. So that is the another criteria. And while coming to the another concern, absence of national level, state level, and district level directory of experts and inventory of sources. So this is everywhere in India we are going to face this. So due to the absence of these level administrations, possibly during the disaster or after the disaster, the response from the government organizations, they fail to plan properly to immigrate the inmates of the particular area of exposed threat. And another area of concern, when you observe absence of national disaster management plan and state level, district level disaster management plans will lead to the damage criteria at a severe level. And sustainability of efforts will also be one of the most important criteria where we deal with. And effective interagency coordination and standard operating procedures for stakeholders groups, especially critical first responder agencies. So the coordination between agencies, whether it may be government agency or a non-government agency. So when they are having proper coordination, definitely they will success effectively. That means they will be succeeded during the planning or managing of the disasters to minimize the damage. And another concern area is emergency medicine, critical care medicine, triage, first aid, etc., etc. So when we are dealing with the supply of the emergencies, why? Because the medicine is one of the most essential supply after the disaster. Why? Because after the disasters, generally there will be might be waterborne or airborne diseases will takes place due to the climatical changes or what we can say stagnation of water or due to the chemicals or due to any other reasons the people will be exposed to the diseases. So to control them, to minimize them, they need emergency supply of the medicine continuously, and the close monitoring of the health is one of the most important rather than of supply of food and shelter. The medication is one of the most important. So for each and every disaster, the ultimate consideration where we are going to consider is the first criteria food supply, and the second criteria shelter, and the third one medication. So whenever the people are being exposed to any sort of disaster, the psychological stability of the people who are through the disaster will be at a very what we can say the psychological strength will be decreased, and not only that, psychologically, physically, they are not well fit to carry on the regular life after the disaster. So those such type of people, the people who are being exposed to the disaster, they need a proper medication along with the counseling. So this counseling will help them to sustain their psychological strength, and as well as their physical, and the life the living of their life with peace of mind is possible. Okay, now let us come to the nodal agencies. Okay, so when we are dealing with nodal agencies, for different disasters, different what we can say organizations are going to take part. For suppose say when we are dealing with floods, so the Ministry of Water Resources will be taking the lead to whatever the necessary administrative part, or whatever the medical supply or food or shelter, whatever it may be. So this so-called agency will take care of the management, so disaster management. So that means when flood comes, it will be Ministry of Water Resources. When cyclone occurs, Indian Meteorological Department will deal with that. And while coming to the earthquakes, Indian Meteorological Department, and epidemics, it will be Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And when it comes to flu, Ministry of Health and Ministry of Environment is also there. And while coming to the Ministry of Agriculture and Animal Husbandry will also be included in flu disasters. And while coming to the chemical disasters, Ministry of Environment and Forest will be involved in this chemical disasters. So these will act as a nodal disaster management during or after the or before the disaster. So while coming to the industrial disasters, Ministry of Labor will take the management of the disaster. And while coming to the rail accidents, as far as railway concerns, Ministry of Railway, and air accidents, Ministry of Civil Aviation, fire, Ministry of Home Affairs, nuclear accidents, Department of Atomic Energy. While coming to the mine disasters, Department of Mines, road accidents, roads and buildings, Department of Roads and Buildings. So this is where the different nodal agencies for different types of disasters will take place. They will play the role during that. That means each and every department, they are supposed to organize different training center, training programs, and need to aware the people in the zones where they belong to. For suppose earthquake prone zones or flood zones, drought zones, cyclone zones, according to the Bureau of Indian Standards that has been described. So in those areas, these agencies will play effectively, and they used to conduct programs to aware them for the awareness, and also they will establish a well equipped early warning systems. So this is where the entire responsibility will be taken according to the concerned nodal agencies. So this and let us come to the lessons learned, best practices. Okay, we will do one thing. From here, we will stop the class, and by the next class, we will continue from best practices. Okay, guys. Now, do you have any questions? You can ask. Guys, if you have any questions, please ask. Okay.